There are fortunes so large they make headlines. And then there are fortunes so personal, so hard-earned, so deeply tied to pain, sacrifice, and survival that they make a family cry. For Céline Dion, the real story was never just the money. Yes, the numbers are staggering. Decades at the top of the music industry, record-breaking album sales, sold-out tours across continents, a Las Vegas empire that redefined what a residency could be. Business deals, publishing rights, luxury properties, and a career built not on one lucky moment, but on relentless discipline. By 2025, Forbes estimated her fortune at roughly $570 million. But for the people closest to her, that number is only the surface. Because what truly overwhelms her family is not what she owns. It is what it cost her to build it. The public saw glamour. They saw the gowns, the power ballads, the standing ovations, the diamond voice that seemed too huge for one human body. They saw a woman who could walk onto any stage in the world and make thousands of people feel like she was singing only to them. For years, Céline Dion did not just perform success, she embodied it. But behind that image was a life shaped by pressure almost from the beginning. Before the private jets, before the mansion headlines, before the Las Vegas millions, there was a girl from a large working-class family in Quebec, raised in a house where money was tight and talent had to fight to be heard. She did not inherit comfort. She built security, note by note, show by show, year after year. And that is part of what makes her financial legacy feel so emotional. It was never abstract. It was survival transformed into greatness. Then came the years that changed everything. In late 2022, Celine revealed that she had been diagnosed with stiff person syndrome, a rare neurological disorder that caused severe muscle spasms and directly affected her ability to sing and function the way she once could. It was not a minor setback. It was the kind of diagnosis that strikes at the center of her identity. Because for Céline Dion, the voice was never just a career. It was purpose. It was control. It was how she loved, how she endured, how she stayed connected to the world. And suddenly, that voice was under threat. Tours were postponed, shows were canceled, public appearances became rare. Fans were left wondering whether one of the greatest vocalists of all time would ever truly return. The woman who had spent a lifetime giving strength to millions was now fighting to preserve the most essential part of herself. Her illness was not just physical. It altered the rhythm of her life, her independence, and the future she had spent years planning. That is when the meaning of her fortune changed. Because when a global icon steps away from the spotlight, money stops looking like luxury and starts looking like protection. It becomes medical care, time, privacy, stability. It becomes the shield around a family trying to hold itself together, while the entire world watches from outside. For Céline's children and loved ones, the tears are not about greed, and they are not about inheritance fantasies. They are about the terrifying realization that all the success in the world cannot spare someone you love from suffering. And yet, even that is not the full story, because Céline Dion refused to disappear quietly. In 2024, she made a powerful public return, first appearing at the Grammy Awards and then delivering a widely celebrated performance at the Paris Olympics opening ceremony. Those moments were not just celebrity appearances, they felt like acts of defiance, proof that even after pain, even after fear, even after the body begins to betray the will, the spirit can still step into the light. Then, in March 2026, she announced a 1-0 show Paris residency, signaling that her fight was not over and that her story was still being written. So when people talk about Céline Dion's fortune, they should understand what that fortune really represents. It is not merely wealth. It is decades of sacrifice. It is grief converted into endurance. It is a mother's determination, an artist's discipline, and a survivor's refusal to surrender. It is the visible result of an invisible battle most people never fully saw. And perhaps that is why her family would cry, not because of the number, but because every dollar, every contract, every sold-out arena, every triumphant return carries the same heartbreaking truth. Behind one of the most successful women in music stands a human being who paid dearly for her place in history. And this is only the beginning of what her legacy truly reveals. Long before Céline Dion became a fortune, she became a promise. And that promise had a name: René Angélil. To the public, he was the manager, the strategist, the older man who saw something in a young girl from Quebec before the rest of the world understood what it was hearing. But inside Céline's story, René was far more than a businessman. He was belief at the exact moment belief mattered most. Reuters noted after his death in 2016 that he had pulled her from childhood obscurity and helped guide her rise to international fame. That kind of bond changes the meaning of success. Because when people look at Céline's wealth now, they see contracts, residencies, royalties, and a career worth hundreds of millions. What they do not immediately see is that so much of it was built inside a partnership. René was not standing outside her empire. He was part of its foundation. He was there before the biggest stages, before the global superstardom, before the brand became untouchable. So when he died in January 2016, after a long battle with cancer, it was not just a personal loss. It was the collapse of one of the most important pillars of her life. And tragedy did not stop there. Just days after losing René, Céline also lost her brother Daniel. Two devastating blows, almost back-to-back. The headlines captured the shock. But headlines cannot measure what that kind of grief does to a person already carrying the weight of a public life. They cannot show what happens when a woman who spent decades being the strong one suddenly has to survive the kind of sorrow that empties a house, a heart, and an entire future all at once. This is where the story of her fortune becomes much darker. Because wealth can buy comfort, but it cannot buy back the one person who knew the whole journey from the beginning. It cannot recreate the private language of a marriage, the quiet routines, the shared decisions, the look across a room that says everything without a word. For Céline, the real value of what she built was never just in possession. It was in who she built it with. And once René was gone, every mansion, every performance milestone, every business triumph had to live beside an absence that money could never soften. Then came motherhood in a new form. Céline was no longer just a superstar carrying a legacy. She was a mother trying to protect 3 sons while moving through extraordinary grief. Recent coverage has continued to emphasize how central her children are to her life. René, Charles, and twins Nelson and Eddie have remained a major source of support and strength for her through both bereavement and illness. People reported this week that family moments with her sons have become some of the most emotionally resonant parts of how the public now sees her life. That detail matters more than people realize. Because when audiences hear a phrase like Céline Dion's fortune, they often imagine inheritance, luxury, and glamorous security. But to a family that has already watched one parent die, fortune can feel less like celebration and more like responsibility. It becomes the burden of preserving a legacy while fearing another loss. It becomes the practical machinery of care, treatment, homes, privacy, and the long emotional work of keeping a family stable while the world keeps asking for performances, photographs, and proof that everything is fine, and everything was not fine. In 2022, Céline publicly revealed she had stiff person syndrome, a rare neurological disorder that forced her away from touring and disrupted the very instrument on which her life had been built, her body and voice. By 2024, the documentary I Am, Céline Dion, had shown audiences how brutal the condition could be, including severe physical episodes, and the emotional toll of living with a disease that threatened both mobility and performance. Her comeback narrative is inspiring, yes, but it also reveals how fragile everything had become behind the scenes. That is why her family's tears, in a story like this, would never be about the number on a balance sheet. They would be about the human cost hidden behind it. A mother fighting through pain, a widow carrying memories in empty rooms, children old enough to understand that fame does not make illness disappear, a legacy so huge it can impress the world, but so emotionally expensive it can break the hearts of the people living closest to it. And yet, there is something almost unbearably moving about Celine Dion's refusal to let grief write the final chapter. Even after cancellations, long silence, and terrifying uncertainty, she returned to public view. She appeared at the 2024 Paris Olympics in one of the most talked-about musical moments of the year. And on the 30th of March 2026, she announced a 1-0 show Paris residency scheduled for September and October 2026, her first major concert run since the diagnosis became public. That does not erase the suffering. It makes the endurance visible. So the true drama of Celine Dion's fortune is not that it is enormous. It is that every part of it now sits beside memory. René is not here to stand next to her and watch the next chapter unfold. The boys are no longer just children being shielded from pain. They are part of the emotional structure that holds her up. And Celine herself is no longer simply the untouchable voice from another era. She is something more complicated and perhaps more powerful. A woman whose wealth proves she conquered the world, and whose suffering proves that even conquest comes at a price. That is what makes this story ache, not the millions, but the possibility that the greatest treasure Celine Dion ever built was never the empire at all. It was the family she kept fighting to stay here for. There is a cruel irony in Celine Dion's life that makes her story almost impossible to hear without emotion. The very gift that gave her everything is also the gift her illness threatened to take away. For most people, a voice is simply part of everyday existence. It rises, it falls, it communicates, but for Celine, her voice was never ordinary. It was livelihood, identity, power, memory, and devotion all fused into one. It was the bridge between a girl from Charlemagne, Quebec, and the global icon who would one day command the largest stages in the world. It was how she carried love, how she processed grief, how she gave the world beauty while hiding how much pain she herself could endure. So when her body began to betray her, the loss was not just physical, it was existential. Imagine spending your entire life becoming the voice people trust in their most emotional moments, only to wake up one day and realize that the mechanism behind that miracle is no longer fully under your control. Imagine being Céline Dion, a woman whose legend was built on precision, discipline, and vocal perfection, and having to face the possibility that the very thing that made you immortal could become fragile. That is the kind of fear money cannot touch. And perhaps this is why the story of her fortune feels so haunting. Because to outsiders, wealth looks like certainty. It looks like a wall against disaster. It looks like proof that someone has won. But illness exposes the lie hidden inside all that glamour. No matter how magnificent the homes, how vast the bank accounts, how historic the career, and the human body remains heartbreakingly vulnerable. For Celine, that vulnerability was made even more painful by memory, because this is not a woman unfamiliar with loss. She had already lived through the death of René, the man who helped shape every important chapter of her life. She had already endured the kind of public grief that most people could barely survive in private. She had already learned what it meant to smile in front of cameras while carrying devastation just under the surface. And then, after surviving that, she was forced into another battle, this time not against sorrow alone, but against her own physical limitations. It is almost too much for one life. And yet, the image the public holds of Céline Dion has always been larger than suffering. That is part of what makes her so compelling. She does not look like defeat. Even in pain, she carries herself with elegance. Even in silence, she seems to radiate presence. Even when she withdraws from the spotlight, people do not forget her. They wait, they hope, they watch for signs that she will return, because something about Celine has always made the world believe in resilience. But resilience is often misunderstood. People talk about it as if it is noble, graceful, almost cinematic. They imagine a woman enduring hardship with perfect dignity, rising from adversity with a beautiful speech and a swelling orchestra behind her. Real resilience is uglier than that. It is exhaustion. It is fear in the middle of the night. It is canceled plans, painful treatments, humiliating limitations, and the emotional burden of letting loved ones see you weak. It is choosing to keep going when the version of yourself you once depended on no longer feels guaranteed. That is the private cost hidden behind public admiration. And this is where her family enters the story in the deepest way. Because when a woman like Celine suffers, her family does not merely witness it, they live inside it with her. Her sons are not just watching a celebrity navigate illness, they are watching their mother fight to preserve her dignity, her purpose, and the life she built for them. They are old enough to understand the stakes, old enough to sense the difference between a temporary setback and a life-altering condition. That kind of awareness changes a family forever. It matures love, it deepens fear, it makes every good day feel precious, and every uncertain day feel heavier. So yes, a fortune may remain. The homes may still stand, the royalties may still arrive, the legacy may still grow. The world may still measure her life in commercial triumphs and cultural milestones. But inside a family, the calculation is entirely different. They are not counting assets. They are counting moments, strength, recovery, presence. They are counting the sound of her laughter, the days when she feels strong, the hours when hope seems bigger than pain. They are measuring wealth in something the public will never fully see. Whether the woman they love can still be fully with them, not just as an icon, but as a mother, a memory maker, a living heart inside their home. That is what gives this story its emotional force. Because the true inheritance Céline Dion leaves to her family is not simply financial. It is moral, it is emotional. It is the example of a woman who kept going through grief, through fear, through bodily betrayal, through the unbearable pressure of being watched by millions and still refused to disappear. That kind of inheritance cannot be deposited, transferred, or divided. It enters a family's bloodline in another way. It becomes character. It becomes perspective. It becomes the standard against which courage is measured. And maybe that is what makes the thought of her legacy so overwhelming. Not that she earned so much, but that she suffered so much while earning it. Not that she built an empire, but that she kept building, even while life kept trying to take pieces of her away. For the audience, Céline Dion is a legend. For her family, she is something far more fragile and far more sacred. She is the woman behind the legend, the voice behind the fortune, the heart behind the empire. And the deeper you look into her story, the clearer it becomes that the most heartbreaking part was never how much she made. It was how much she had to endure to become unforgettable. What makes Céline Dion's story so devastating is not just the scale of her suffering, it is the contrast. Few women in modern music have looked more untouchable from the outside. She stood beneath lights that made everything shimmer. She wore couture, diamonds, and the kind of confidence that only comes from surviving decades in an industry designed to replace people the moment they begin to age. Her voice filled arenas. Her name alone could sell emotion before she even sang the first line. To the world, she did not merely appear successful, she appeared invincible. And that illusion is precisely what makes the truth so painful. Because behind every image of glamour was a woman carrying extraordinary emotional weight. Behind every perfect note was a life that had already been shaped by sacrifice. Behind the wealth, the applause, and the myth of total control was someone who knew, perhaps more than most, how quickly life can turn cruel. That is why the idea of fortune becomes almost tragic in her case. Fortune suggests safety. It suggests arrival. It suggests that the hardest part is over. But what if the hardest part begins after the world decides you have already won? That is the hidden terror inside Celine Dion's life. She reached the summit only to learn that even the summit cannot protect the people you love, cannot preserve the body forever, cannot freeze happiness in place. You can own mansions and still feel loneliness echo through them. You can command millions and still be powerless in the face of disease. You can become one of the most recognized women on earth and still return home to private fears no audience can applaud away. This is why stories like hers stay with people. They force us to confront something uncomfortable. Success does not cancel sorrow. In fact, sometimes it amplifies it. Because the higher someone rises, the more shocking it is to witness their pain. A woman living an ordinary life suffers, and the world may never notice. But when a legend suffers, the contrast is unbearable. We see the gowns, the stages, the wealth, the legacy, and then we see the vulnerability underneath it all. And suddenly, the entire architecture of celebrity feels fragile. Céline Dion embodies that fragility in a way very few stars do. She never seemed cynical. She never built her identity around emotional distance. If anything, her entire career depended on sincerity. She sang as if feeling too much was not a weakness, but a duty. She gave people songs for weddings, funerals, divorces, reunions, and private heartbreaks they could not explain any other way. For years, audiences borrowed her voice to survive their own emotional lives. And now, the cruel reversal is that the same world that once leaned on her strength looks at her and sees someone fighting to hold on to her own. There is something almost unbearable in that reversal, because when a person gives comfort for a living, we unconsciously begin to imagine they will always remain powerful enough to do it. We forget that the vessel can break. We forget that the artist is a body before she is a symbol. We forget that even icons have mornings filled with pain, doubt, exhaustion, and fear. And maybe that is why her family's place in this story feels so important. To the public, Celine is a phenomenon. To her children, she is not a phenomenon. She is home. She is the voice in the next room. She is the woman whose presence organizes the emotional gravity of a family. That is why any discussion of her wealth feels incomplete without acknowledging the emotional reality surrounding it. The money matters, yes. The empire matters. The legacy matters. But none of it can replace what she means in human terms to the people who love her most. That is where the tears come from, not from inheritance, from helplessness, from the unbearable distance between what the world sees and what a family feels. The world sees a legend with a monumental career and enormous resources. A family sees the daily truth, the strain, the uncertainty, the moments of bravery that never make headlines, the effort it takes to smile when pain is nearby, the courage required simply to keep imagining a future when the body has become unpredictable. This is what transforms her fortune into something far more emotional than money. It becomes evidence. Evidence of how hard she worked. Evidence of how much she gave. Evidence that she turned talent into security for the people she loves. But it also becomes evidence of something sadder, that she had to build so much because life kept proving how unstable everything can be. The fortune is not just proof of victory, it is proof of preparation, of responsibility, of a woman who understood that love sometimes means building a wall around your family before the storm arrives. And still, even the strongest wall cannot keep out grief. That may be the deepest wound in the entire Celine Dion story. She did everything right. She worked harder than almost anyone. She protected her family. She honored her gifts. She survived public pressure, personal loss, and impossible expectations. She built a legacy vast enough to outlive any headline. And even then, life came for her piece. There is no clean lesson in that. Only truth. The truth that some people become great not because they were spared suffering, but because they continued through it. The truth that the wealthiest lives can still contain the most private anguish. The truth that a woman can be adored by millions and still be most profoundly needed by just a few people in one family who do not care about the legend nearly as much as they care about the person. And perhaps that is what makes Céline Dion's story more than dramatic. It makes it human. Because once you strip away the fame, the money, and the mythology, what remains is painfully simple. A woman who gave the world her voice, built a kingdom out of devotion and discipline, and still had to face the same fragile reality that waits for every human being in the end. The difference is that she had to face it while the whole world was watching. By the time a person becomes Céline Dion, the public no longer sees a life. It sees a symbol of talent, of endurance, of fame that outlived trends, scandals, and entire generations of pop culture. A symbol of what happens when discipline meets destiny and turns a gifted child into one of the most recognizable voices on earth. But symbols are dangerous things, because the brighter they shine, the easier it becomes to forget that there is a real human being trapped inside them. That is what makes this chapter of Céline Dion's story so emotionally devastating. The world still wants the symbol. It still wants the miracle, the towering note, the unforgettable entrance, the evidence that some people really are larger than life. But her family does not need the symbol. They need the woman. They need the mother who sits with them, speaks to them, laughs with them, remembers with them, and remains present not as a legend, but as the emotional center of their world. And those are two very different kinds of need. The public's love is enormous, but it is also abstract. It exists through admiration, nostalgia, applause, and expectation. A family's love is smaller in scale, but infinitely heavier in meaning. It lives in ordinary moments. It asks different questions, not whether the next performance will happen, not whether the comeback will silence critics, but whether she slept well, whether she is in pain, whether today is easier than yesterday, whether hope feels close enough to touch. That is the private world money cannot simplify. And yet Céline spent much of her life trying to create that simplification for the people she loved. That is what her fortune really represents at the deepest level. Not greed, not excess, not some glamorous obsession with more. It represents protection. It represents a woman who understood that fame is unstable, health is fragile, and happiness can disappear without warning. So, she built. She kept building. She built an empire strong enough to outlast bad seasons, private grief, and even the terrifying possibility that one day she might not be able to give the world what it expected anymore. That is not vanity. That is love in structural form. Every sold-out show, every contract, every negotiation, every exhausting commitment became part of a larger promise. Her children would be secure. Her family would be cared for. The people closest to her would have shelter, privacy, options, and dignity no matter what life decided to do next. In that sense, her fortune is not merely an achievement. It is a maternal act stretched across decades. And maybe that is why it hurts so much to think about. Because when a fortune is built out of love, it becomes impossible to separate the money from the sacrifice behind it. Every triumph contains exhaustion. Every milestone contains absence. Every new level of success asks what had to be postponed, endured, or silently survived to reach it. People love to talk about what stars gain, but rarely about what they surrender along the way. Time, rest, simplicity, privacy, ease. The chance to be fragile without frightening the people who depend on you. Céline Dion surrendered more than most. She gave the world not just talent, but emotional labor on a massive scale. She sang other people through their losses while managing her own. She held herself upright through public appearances when grief could have buried her. She kept the machinery of legacy moving when lesser people would have disappeared. And when illness threatened to redraw the boundaries of her life, she still found ways to remain present, visible, and dignified. That kind of strength does not come without cost. And her children, more than anyone, are in a position to understand that. Because children eventually reach the age where they stop seeing their parents as permanent, they begin to notice exhaustion in the face, caution in the movement, pain hidden in the pause between words. They begin to understand history, not just personality. They learn what their mother survived before they were old enough to name it. They realize that the person who always seemed strong was often choosing strength, not simply possessing it. That realization changes everything. It transforms admiration into ache. It makes gratitude inseparable from fear. It turns legacy from a glamorous word into an intimate one. For Celine's family, legacy is not just the catalog of songs, the awards, the millions, the properties, or the place in music history. Legacy is the memory of how she kept going, how she remained elegant in pain, how she carried grief without letting it poison love, how she continued to fight for presence, even when presence itself became harder to sustain. That is what will stay with them long after headlines fade. And that may be the most heartbreaking truth of all. The larger her public legacy becomes, the more her private one matters. Because one day, people who never met her will still stream the songs, study the career, and speak about her as an icon from another era. They will discuss numbers, rankings, and milestones. They will use words like legendary, unmatched, timeless. But her family will remember something much quieter. They will remember tone of voice, expressions, the emotional temperature of a room when she entered it, the way pain coexisted with tenderness, the strange mixture of grandeur and vulnerability that made her unforgettable not just to the world, but to the people who had to love her in real life. And that is where the phrase, fortune, that makes her family cry, finally becomes meaningful. Not because the fortune is shocking, not because the number is unbelievable, but because it stands there like a monument to everything she carried. It is visible proof of invisible effort. It is the material shape of decades of devotion. It is what remains when talent, discipline, heartbreak, motherhood, ambition, illness, and survival are all forced into one life and somehow turned into something lasting. A lesser story would end with the money. Céline Dion's story does not, because the money is only the shell. Inside it is grief, love, fear, faith, memory, duty, and a woman who refused, again and again, to let suffering be the thing that defined her most. That is why her story lingers. That is why it hurts. And that is why, for the people closest to her, the real inheritance was never going to be the fortune alone. It was the example of how to remain luminous, even when life gives you every reason to disappear. In the end, the world will probably do what it always does with women like Céline Dion. It will simplify them. It will reduce an impossible life into a few convenient images. The voice, the gowns, the love story, the grief, the illness, the comeback, the fortune. It will package her into headlines and tributes, into dramatic captions and emotional montages, into a story that feels easy enough to consume in a few minutes. But lives like hers are not easy. They are layered, contradictory, expensive in every sense of the word. And that is exactly why her story continues to haunt people. Because Céline Dion was never just rich. She was earned. Everything about her life feels earned. The success was earned. The reverence was earned. The security was earned. The right to be called legendary was earned. Even the silence around her, in recent years, has felt earned because it came after a lifetime of giving the public more than most artists ever could. She did not inherit a throne. She built one while standing in heels, under pressure, in grief, and in full view of a world that was always ready to demand one more song. That is why her fortune carries emotional weight far beyond money. It is not only wealth, it is compressed time. It is decades of labor, discipline, heartbreak, repetition, sacrifice, and impossible stamina, condensed into numbers the public can understand, because the emotional truth behind them is too large to measure directly. When people hear that a woman like Céline Dion has built an enormous fortune, they imagine abundance. But what they are really seeing is the financial outline of a life spent carrying extraordinary responsibility. And perhaps that is what her family understands most deeply, because families always know the hidden version of greatness. They know what the audience never sees. They know how much energy it took to appear radiant. They know which smiles were brave, which appearances were painful, which seasons required more endurance than glamour. They know the difference between applause and recovery. They know that some victories are followed not by celebration, but by collapse. They know that behind a monumental public image, there was a human being trying, day after day, to keep love intact, while everything else threatened to become overwhelming. So when the world stares at her legacy and sees fortune, her family may see something much more emotional. They may see evidence of what she protected, a future she built for them, a shield she tried to place around them, a promise, made not in words but in work, that no matter how uncertain life became, she would leave behind structure, safety, and proof that she fought for them with everything she had. That is a different kind of inheritance, and in many ways it is heavier than money. Money can be counted, it can be divided, it can be managed by lawyers, accountants, and signatures. But the deeper inheritance left by someone like Céline Dion cannot be processed so neatly. It lives in the nervous system of a family. It changes the way people understand courage. It changes what children believe strength looks like. It leaves behind a model of endurance so intense that it becomes both a comfort and a burden. Because once you have watched someone you love survive that much, ordinary definitions of bravery never seem quite enough again. That may be the truest legacy Celine leaves. Not perfection, not invincibility, but witness. The witness of a woman who kept standing in the light, even after life gave her every reason to retreat into darkness. The witness of a mother who kept thinking beyond herself. The witness of an artist who understood that the voice alone was never the miracle. The miracle was the will behind it, the refusal, the devotion, the decision to continue being present, even when presence became painful. And that is where this story becomes bigger than celebrity. Because at its core, Céline Dion's life touches a fear almost everyone understands. The fear that everything you build can still be threatened by time, grief, illness, and loss. Her story is dramatic because her scale is enormous, but the emotional truth inside it is painfully ordinary. We all want to believe that love can be protected, that sacrifice will buy safety, that enough effort can hold tragedy back. Her life reminds us, with heartbreaking elegance, that it cannot, but it also reminds us of something else, that even when safety cannot be guaranteed, meaning can still be created. That even when the body weakens, love can remain powerful. That even when life takes what feels unbearable, dignity can still survive. That even when the future becomes uncertain, a person can still leave behind something stronger than fear. This is why the story of Céline Dion's fortune lands so hard. Not because it is enormous, though it is. Not because it is glamorous, though it certainly looks that way from the outside. But because it stands at the intersection of all the things human beings care about most: love, family, suffering, survival, memory, and the desperate hope that what we give to the people we love will remain with them when we no longer can protect them directly. For the audience, that idea is emotional. For her family, it is personal. They do not just see a music icon, they see the cost of becoming one. They do not just see the empire, they see the years that built it. They do not just see the fortune, they see the woman inside it. And maybe that is the final truth this story has been moving toward all along. Céline Dion's family would not cry because she built so much. They would cry because they know what it took. They know the nights the public never saw. They know the absences hidden inside the triumphs. They know the pain that sat behind the poise. They know that what looks like wealth to the world looks like sacrifice to the people who loved her up close. So yes, she built a fortune. Yes, she created a legacy vast enough to outlive headlines, trends, and even generations. Yes, she gave the world a voice it will likely never hear the same way again. But the most powerful thing she leaves behind may be something no number can hold. The example of a woman who turned suffering into strength, grief into devotion, and love into something strong enough to endure even the most heartbreaking chapters of life. That is not just wealth, that is immortality. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about a life like Céline Dion's. The world calls it extraordinary, but at its emotional center, it is built from the same fragile materials as any other life. Love, fear, duty, loss, hope, and the unbearable knowledge that none of it lasts forever. That is what makes her story hit so hard. Not simply because she became famous, not simply because she became wealthy, not simply because she endured more than most people ever knew, but because she managed to do all of it while remaining, somehow, emotionally recognizable. Beneath the legend, beneath the impossible voice, beneath the public image polished by decades of scrutiny, Céline Dion still feels like a woman trying to hold on to what matters before time takes more of it away. And maybe that is why audiences cannot look away. Because in her, they do not just see greatness. They see mortality dressed in elegance. They see what happens when a person reaches the kind of success most people only dream about, only to discover that success cannot negotiate with grief. It cannot reason with disease. It cannot persuade the body to obey forever. It cannot return the dead. It cannot promise tomorrow. All it can do is stand there, glittering and enormous, while the heart continues asking for things money was never designed to buy. That is the tragedy hidden inside the triumph. Céline Dion spent a lifetime becoming larger than life, and yet life itself kept reminding her that no one is larger than loss. Not even her. Maybe especially not her. Because the more luminous a person becomes, the more painful it is to watch that light flicker. The more a voice has carried millions through heartbreak, the more devastating it is to imagine that voice under threat. The more a mother has built for her children, the more emotional it becomes to realize that the most precious thing she can leave them is not property, not royalty checks, not prestige, but the memory of how fiercely she loved them while fighting through suffering. That is what makes the title of her story feel almost misleading. A fortune can make people stare, but it is not what makes them cry. What makes them cry is what the fortune represents. The years she can never get back. The parts of herself she had to spend. The quiet damage hidden behind the polished image. The courage required to keep showing up when life had already taken too much. That is the real inheritance. For her children, the greatest legacy may not be financial security, though that matters. It may not even be the historic catalog of songs, though that will echo for generations. It may be the private memory of a mother who kept choosing love over despair, a woman who could have surrendered to grief, but didn't, a woman who could have allowed illness to become the whole definition of her final chapter, but refused, a woman who taught, not through speeches but through sheer example, that grace is not the absence of pain, it is the decision to remain tender in spite of it. That lesson is priceless. And it is also heartbreaking, because the people closest to her know better than anyone that such strength is never free. They know it drains the body. They know it costs peace. They know it often requires a person to keep walking while wounded, simply because too many others are depending on her to stop. That is the kind of heroism the public romanticizes and families understand in much more painful terms. Families know the bill comes due somewhere. In exhaustion, in silence, in tears behind closed doors, in the private moments after the cameras are gone, when the performance ends and the real work of survival begins. Céline Dion's life, when stripped of celebrity language, is the story of a woman who kept paying that bill again and again. She paid it in discipline when she was young. She paid it in devotion when love demanded trust. She paid it in grief when death entered her home. She paid it in endurance when illness challenged the very center of who she was. And still, somehow, she kept giving. That is why her story feels almost sacred to the people who love her. Because eventually, after enough pain, love stops admiring strength in a glamorous way. It begins to see it for what it really is, a form of sacrifice. Not theatrical sacrifice, real sacrifice. The kind that leaves marks, the kind that reshapes a family's emotional memory forever. The kind that makes people cry not because they are shocked by what was gained, but because they understand what was given. So if one day the world tries to summarize Céline Dion with numbers, rankings, net worth estimates, and career milestones, it will only be telling the smallest part of the truth. The bigger truth is more difficult and more human. She built a life that looked magnificent from a distance, but up close, it was held together by devotion, by pain endured quietly, by love expressed through relentless work, by a refusal to let tragedy be the loudest voice in the room. And maybe that is the final reason her legacy feels so overwhelming. Because when people think of Céline Dion, they think of sound, power, range, emotion. But the true legacy she leaves her family may be something even deeper than voice. It may be proof that suffering does not always destroy a person, proof that grief can live beside beauty, proof that a mother can build safety even while fighting private battles, proof that the human spirit, when fueled by love, can remain radiant long after life has become unbearably heavy. That is what her family would carry. Not merely the fortune, but the proof of who she was when life was cruel, proof of how she loved when fear was real, proof of how much one woman was willing to endure, so the people she cherished most would never doubt they were protected. And once you understand that, the story changes completely. It is no longer about a celebrity fortune. It is about a woman whose real wealth was measured in devotion, whose real power was measured in endurance, and whose real legacy was written not only in music history, but in the hearts of the people who watched her suffer, fight, return, and keep loving anyway. That is why this story does not end in glamour. It ends in reverence. Because beyond the empire, beyond the illness, beyond the tears, beyond the voice itself, there remains one final truth about Céline Dion. She did not just become unforgettable because she was gifted. She became unforgettable because she was strong enough to remain full of love even after life gave her every reason to break.